Hello and welcome to World Talks, where every word matters. I'm Anna Kalczyńska. Good morning. 6 delegations left the OSCE forum in Malta yesterday when Russia Minister for Foreign Affairs Sergei Lavrov entered the room. Their gesture was followed by yet a stronger political call to exclude Russia, at least temporarily, from the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. Radosław Sikorski, speaking after the organization meeting, said, "Russia is destroying Ukraine, but it is destroying its country's future. Until it ends this brutal war, its membership in the OSCE should be suspended." Now, to suspend or to exclude a member, it's not an easy process, but how realistic is it in the current political status quo? To discuss this matter, I'm joined by Artur Koldomasov, non-resident fellow, Global Governance Institute. Good morning, sir. Good to have you.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the simple question on the law. That is, what does the Charter say? Is it possible even to suspend or to exclude a member?
The thing is that the procedure to exclude members from the OSCE is very complicated in the legal perspective because the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is the OSCE, is not institutionalized as the UN, for example, because this is the organization founded and based on one document, which is the Helsinki Final Act. And basically, the mechanisms of excluding people from organization or countries, or if we talk very precisely, participating states in that case. It's very complicated. There were precedents for that during the Yugoslav wars. However, we also need to remember the concept and the history behind the OSCE. Meanwhile, I personally would love not to see the Russian delegation there. However, this is the organization that has been created with the Soviet Union in mind. And this is the forum that also has been created to actually unite Central Asian countries with Russia, the United States, Canada, and other European states under one umbrella. And there's no alternative for that currently at that moment except of the UN, which is not that purposeful in the context of the security issues in that thing. So we really need to remember how realistic that decision might be, and also what is actually the concept behind the organization. So if we imagine that Russia is excluded, which we would all want, we would still end up with the coalition of like-minded countries that would still have the same issues with the OSCE as we already have. Plus, there are other reasons why it's better to keep Russia in the OSCE even at that moment, and even if it's difficult, rather than to exclude it.
All right. Well, as you rightly said, OSCE it was founded in the middle of the Cold War, 1975, and it's today one of the largest regional organizations with 57 members. It was called upon to tackle the biggest challenges of the 21st century. So my question is, how can a member state of OSCE deal with a challenge it has created himself in the first place?
That's a very good question. And unfortunately, from the very beginning, the OSCE, but back at that time, the CSCE, which was the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, has always been very heavy leaning towards the Soviet perspective. And this always has been the organization that was actually playing along the Russian interest for a very long time. But also at the same time, this is a category of things that we notice when it's gone. And the thing is that despite Russia being a very bad actor on the international arena, the OSCE and membership in other international organizations still presents some kind of leverage over its actions in the legal perspective, meaning that it's important to have all of that recorded and noticed in the international institutional framework for the future accountability measures. And if we exclude Russia from the OSCE at that moment, it leaves it in the non-controllable space of actions, because Russia at least has some guardrails in this organization and in other ones. When it leaves, it does not have these guardrails at all, meaning that the situation could get even worse. Also, we have to remember that despite Russia acting this way, and despite also Russia presenting all these crazy statements and all this crazy rhetoric, which is very, very, very much synchronized with the state propaganda machine, we also need to remember that they try to look like they don't care, but actually they do care, because if you compare, for example, the number of media commentary of the representatives of the Western states to its own media and the Russian representatives, Russian delegation members to its own media, you can see a very huge gap. The Russian members of the delegation to the OSCE are given at least one interview to the state media in 2 weeks. This is a very crazy schedule for the modern diplomat. And that also signals that the OSCE is also a very important instrument for them, but also it's an important tool for Europe itself, because as a person who has been working for some time with that topic and has been directly present at the OSCE for quite some time, and was seeing all of that playing out in person, I can say that many times Russia is trying to present their many propaganda narratives before they go public. And actually, because, for example, the permanent council meetings are off public, they are not available publicly. All other delegations, they help to at least stop some disinformation from spreading in their countries.
All right.
Meaning that they learn about that in the
I understand, yes.
of the Permanent Council in Hofburg.
So that gives us some time.
Don't allow for it to spread even further.
All right. But this is not the first time a country called for Russia to be suspended or excluded from the OSCE. Ukraine did it last year and boycotted the meeting at that time. This year, however, Ukraine attended the Malta gathering amid a worsening situation on the battlefront and losing ground in OSCE. Is OSCE a place of channeling communication between both sides on the conflict? Is it a possible venue just to negotiate at somehow, or at least listen to each other?
This has been going on since the Russian aggression against Ukraine has started. These calls are repeated by Ukraine and its allies in the organization from that time all along. Meanwhile, the OSCE itself is kind of being paralyzed by Russia itself, by the way, because it's consensus based. And now Russia is blocking, for example, the budgetary increase for the organization, meaning that the organization is living by the annual budget each year that does not include the inflation provisions, which makes their job really complicated, and the implementation of many projects also very complicated. But also at the same time, this has been a very huge challenge for the OSCE to prevent this from happening, and it was one of its main tasks for it, and it failed. However, we have to remember that despite the OSCE not being very useful at that moment, when the peace talks will happen, the OSCE will most likely become the organization that will implement many components of the future peace deal, or at least the components that amplify that.
All right.
So we don't need to rule the OSCE out from the equation. I know that, for example, the reputation of the OSCE in Ukraine is horrible because of many actions that the organization has done previously in the context of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. However, the reality is, and we need to be realistic because we need to understand how all of that works, and we need to understand how to make this work with the available tools. Realistically speaking, we need to understand that the OSCE will most likely play some role, at least some role, in the future post-conflict transformation process.
So my last question to you would be, if we were, for the sake of this discussion, just to assume the body gets to vote such a motion of suspension, which countries would you think would oppose and which countries would be in favor of such a motion? And so are the chances Russia gets suspended slim or rather quite big, in your opinion?
The chances of it being expelled, to be honest, are not that realistic, even from that perspective, because, as I mentioned earlier, this is the consensus-based organization, meaning that all its participating states have to agree to the important decisions. There are some methods with, for example, the absolute majority or qualified majority vote that are discussed for that. However, we still need to remember that there's a portion of countries in the OSCE that don't align with for example, European vision for that issue, and that also would not vote for Russia's exclusion. For example, the whole bloc of Central Asian countries, most possibly some micro-states, and also, for example, we have Hungary and we have Malta that would most likely not vote for that. So it would be really difficult to gather the votes for that, actually.
Artur Koldomasov, thank you very much. Non-resident fellow, Global Governance Institute, was our guest this morning. Thank you very much, sir, for your time. As you have heard, idea has many pros and cons, so let's see what the time brings. This was World Talks, but please stay tuned to TVP World as more news and more features coming next.